If you're building a web application with a front end and a back end, it's not unlikely that you'll want to provide some sort of file upload. But by allowing users to upload files to your backend, you also open up a potential security vulnerability. Therefore, it is important to validate the files that users upload. In this video, I will show you some possible ways to implement such validation in ASP.NET Core. I have prepared a very simple example. I have an ASP.NET Core Web API backend and an ASP.NET Core frontend that uses Razor pages. In this Razor page, I simply input a file input. Here I can set the accept attribute, which will give the user a hint as to which file types they can select. But, and this is important, it will not prevent the user from selecting a file with a different extension. Alright, next I just add some JavaScript so that when the user chooses a file with the file picker, we just take the file and send it to our backend. Now let us go to the site backend to the program CS of our web API to be precise. I simply create a post method that takes a form file collection as a parameter and simply returns an OK result. I won't do anything else in the method. We'll set breakpoint here and see what happens in the debugger. Alright, let's try this out and see if our simple file upload works. I select a file from my file system and my breakpoint in the backend post method is immediately hit. The form file collection contains the file we selected. Awesome. Now I want to restrict the files sent to my backend to certain file extensions. How can I do that? There are several ways. One would be to add a jag right here in the method, but I didn't want to do that. I want to create a reusable solution. As a first step, I'll create a new class that is responsible for checking if all files submitted in a request are valid considering the file extension. I'll call it File Upload Validator. This class has a method called contains_bad_files, which takes the request, an enumerable of allowed extensions, and an output parameter with the name of the invalid file. In the method, I check if there are any files in the request. If so, I loop through the files, take the extension of the file, and check if it is allowed. If it is not allowed, I set the file name and the out parameter and return true, meaning there is an invalid file in the request, otherwise I return false. So now we have a class that does the validation for us, but where can we use it? One option is an endpoint filter. For each endpoint, we can add endpoint filters, which are classes that implement the iEndpoint filter interface. Let's do that. I will create a new class called File Upload Endpoint Filter and implement the iEndpoint filter interface, which contains a method called invokeAsync. In this method, I call the File Upload Validator we just created and pass in the request, the allowed extension we get from the constructor, and I also specify the out parameter. If the method returns true, it means that there is a file sent in the request that is not allowed, so in this case we return a bad request result with an error message. Otherwise, everything is fine and we call the next endpoint filter by calling the delegate. And that is all we need to do in this file. Now we can use this filter. To do this, we simply go back to program CS and call the addEndpointFilter method for our upload endpoint, passing a new instance of our File Upload Endpoint Filter class and specifying the allowed file extensions. To see how this works, I place a breakpoint at the beginning of our upload endpoint method and another one in the invokeAsync method of the endpoint filter. First I select an allowed file, in this case a PDF file. The file is immediately sent to the backend and first we hit the breakpoint in the endpoint filter. So we step inside the File Upload Validator, we go through the files, get the extension and check if it is allowed, which it is in this case. So we'll leave the method, back to the endpoint filter and the next delegate is invoked. Okay, so now I continue the execution and now the breakpoint in the actual endpoint method is hit and we see the file in the form file collection. Right. Now let us do the same with the file that is not allowed. Again, we hit the breakpoint in the endpoint filter. This time we figure out that this extension is not allowed, so we return a bad request result here. The next delegate is not called this time. When I resume the execution, the second breakpoint in the upload endpoint is not hit. This means that the filter has prevented our endpoint from being invoked with an invalid file. Just what we wanted. We also see in the Network tab of the browser debugger tools that the request failed with status 400 and we also see the error message. This method allows you to control the allowed file extensions per endpoint. Another way to restrict file uploads would be to use custom middleware that acts as a general file upload filter for all of your endpoints. This would look something like this. First, we create a new class called File Upload Middleware. In the constructor, I expect a request delegate called next and an iConfiguration object. Then I create a public async method called invoke, takes the HTTP context as a parameter. Inside the method, I read the allowed extensions from the configuration because I stored them as a comma-separated list in the app settings JSON file. After checking if there is a value in the configuration and separating the value by comma, we do pretty much the same as we did in the endpoint filter. We call a validation method. If it returns true, set the response to status 400, write the error message, and do not call the next delegate. Back in program CS, I quickly comment out the endpoint filter, and then before the map post call for our endpoint, I call use middleware, specifying the custom endpoint we just created. When we try this again, the result is the same as before. This time invalid files are blocked by the middleware, ensuring that the upload endpoint is called if all the files sent are valid. Alright, these are 2 ways to limit file uploads in your ASP.NET Core application. What do you think? What else should you be aware of when you want to provide file uploads in your endpoint? Let me know in the comments below. That's it for this video. If you're unsure whether you should use ASP.NET Core or Node.js for your web project, I have compared the performance between the two in this video. Feel free to watch it next. Thanks for watching. Bye.